most of the audience will, of course, know Mr. Blair as the former Prime Minister of the UK, the only Labour leader to win 3 consecutive elections. Since 2017, though, Tony's areas of work have formally come together under the umbrella of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And in normal times, the Institute focuses on helping nations to deliver effective governance for their people, tackling extremism, working to deliver long-term regional peace and security in the Middle East, and on developing the policy answers to the challenges posed by the rise of populism and insecurity in the West. But since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Institute has pivoted to support leaders across the globe by delivering analysis and advice. And much of that analysis has focused on the power of technology, not only to take us through the immediate crisis, but the critical role it can play to build the future that we need to reinvent, as well as to recover and to build back with purpose. So welcome, Tony Blair, to the global leadership stage. As the title suggests, we will explore lessons for the world, but perhaps let us start with lessons for our leaders. It's great to have you here. So on the subject of global leadership, Tony, you've spoken about the absence of global leadership in response to the pandemic. And in its absence, there's been a rise of protectionism, populism, debates about onshoring, how we secure our global supply chains, adapt, as well as tangible measures such as bans on exports of certain goods. Relations between China and the US have in particular become increasingly strained. What lessons do you have for the leaders of both our government and for our businesses?
Okay, first of all, Jacqueline, thanks very much for having me at CogX, a great conference. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be with you all, and hello everyone who's listening in. Look, this is the most difficult challenge that governments have ever faced. So first off, you know, I huge sympathy and solidarity for the people taking decisions right now. And you know, this is a unique situation, unique in its scale and its consequences, in how it presents government with really difficult decisions around risk, because you've not just got the risk of the COVID disease itself, but you've also got the risks of the lockdown, economic, social, and health. So it's immensely difficult to formulate the right calculus of risk and then implement it. But my thought, very simply, is that this is a situation where every country's interests are best served by coming together on certain of key questions. How you accelerate the development of vaccines and therapeutics, how you develop the tests that allow you easy point of use testing of people, how you coordinate global economic policy so that you reflate the economy after what will be a really deep recession, how you share the best practice of what works for different professions, you know, how do you restart the travel, the tourism industry, and so on. So a certain degree of global coordination seems to be enlightened self-interest. Now, to be fair, I think in the last weeks you've seen greater attempts from the Europeans, for example, to put together the right economic packages. The US has got a big package, the UK as well, but we're still a long way from where we need to be, I think.
Yes, collaboration and sharing, looking outwards, not inwards, perhaps. Having a strong strategy in place is one thing, though, but how important do you think communication and messaging is to ensure that strategies that we do put together have some purchase and build public confidence?
Yeah, this is absolutely vital, because all the time people are wrestling with two fears. We know enough about the disease. Most of us know people who've either died from it or have had a serious encounter with the disease, as well as obviously lots of people who haven't, but you know enough about it to know you don't want it. And at the same time, the truth is only a small number of people will be very adversely affected, and only a small number of people at any one time, proportionate to the whole of the population, will have it. And the problem is you have to lock down everyone in order to guard against the risk to a relatively small number of people. And so this is the dilemma people are wrestling with. And what is important, therefore, is to communicate how you're making these decisions as a government and explain to people, take people through the evidence as it develops as to those people most at risk, what is the right ways to do social distancing and minimize the risk to yourself to shield effectively. You know, there's a whole set of things. How do you make best use of the testing facilities you've got, which I think you need to explain to people at every step of this, because communication is so vital. But you know, the other thing that's different about this disease is that even with, say, 9/11 or the global financial crisis, of course, these were big talking points, but most people carried on with their lives in a reasonably predictable and normal way. Okay, people talked about it and were worried about it, but the difference with this pandemic is everyone's life has changed. Your life has changed, my life has changed. We're all living differently. So there's an enormous interest in and focus on the disease. Therefore, it's even more important for governments and policymakers to be taking people into their confidence in order to build confidence.
Yes, it's that transparency really matters at the moment, doesn't it? With encouraging people to get engaged and to really listen to the advice of government.
Yeah,
and public
you know,
figures.
absolutely. And also, for example, you know, to understand, yes, there are risks to people under the age of 40 or under the age of 60, but they're much, much smaller than the risk to elderly people or the most vulnerable. Or, for example, people worry about sending their children back to school. You've got to explain to people, yes, there's nothing that we're going to do in this situation that doesn't carry some risk, but you've got to measure that risk against the risk, for example, of an entire group of young children, usually the most socially deprived or most economically distressed young people, not getting the education they need.
Yeah, and that is something, isn't it, that a lot of people are talking about in terms of there is perhaps the opportunity, possibility and challenge of creating a bigger divide between the haves and the have-nots, which is very disturbing as a consequence of the COVID-19 situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely, of course, and this is going to be a big problem. It's a problem. It's a problem, I think, also because, as you will be exploring at the conference, the truth is that all of the things that were there before COVID are there during and after COVID, but I think accelerated and more vivid. And one of those is the use of technology. So that was already important, obviously, before the COVID crisis, but now it's even more important as to how we get through it and then what we do afterwards. And that digital divide between those that are familiar and can use the new technology well and those that can't is obviously going to be a big source of difficulty.
Yes, well, I'm a technology optimist, as you might imagine, as president of techUK. And, you know, the things that we're seeing are from, you know, brilliant businesses and households that have been able to adopt technology, and life has moved on in a very positive way. But talking about technology as we look at it in a post-lockdown context, many countries are emerging from lockdown and into a new context. The Institute for Global Change has written about how technology can help us navigate the new world that we find ourselves in. And you have, for example, just published a paper on the role of digital identity or credentials, which could play a role in restarting the UK economy alongside mass testing. So often these technology solutions do rely on public uptake. And how do you believe we can create an environment of trust and build technology ethically so that we don't just provide solutions for now, but for the future too?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And look, what we're saying in this paper is you can create a digital ID today that is much more easily protected, so you can deal with a lot of the privacy and surveillance issues that worry people. But it's a natural evolution of the way that we're going to use technology in any event to transact daily life. And this COVID crisis gives an additional reason for doing that, because look, I could be wrong about this, but when I look at, for example, how you restart some businesses, how you restart international travel, I think people's disease status, for example, have they been tested? What is the result of that test? Have they had the disease? Do they have the disease? I think unless you're able to record some of this data in a way that people can use, it's going to be difficult to go back to anything like a near normal in things like transport. So if you're going to start international travel again, how do you do that unless people can be easily tested and have some record of that test? So I think there's always been a good case for introducing some form of digital ID, but I think that case is even more powerful today. So my point about technology, and it's one of the focuses of the Institute, because my essential belief is that the technology revolution is the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution. In other words, it changes everything. It changes the way we live, the way we work, the way we think. It changes our business, changes our commerce, it changes our social interactions. And the risk is that you have this divide between the world of the change makers, those with technology, innovation and creativity making the changes, and the policy makers, those in politics, in my profession. And there's a great gulf of misunderstanding between the two. And you've got to bridge that, because a lot of these technology solutions will be extremely important for us to solve the practical problems, not just of COVID, but of the new world of work and the economy that we're going to see develop in the next few years. So this is why it's important now and afterwards to put technology at the center of what we do.
How do we then, though, make sure that we create a world that works for everybody? Because there will be some people who can't use technology, don't use technology as well. How do we make sure we don't leave them behind?
Give them the chance to be educated, to be skilled, to be retrained, to have access. Make sure that there's universal coverage. Make sure that, for example, when we're educating our young people today, we're educating them to be fully able to work in this new world. A lot of people will be retraining and reskilling. Use it as an opportunity. I mean, there are many people who will find when they go back out into the new economic landscape and the government support systems stop, there will be many of those people in businesses that have been changed forever. I can't see the travel, tourism, hospitality industries coming back very fast. I think bricks and mortar retail has probably had its day, actually. I mean, certainly in its present form. So you're going to, in any event, have a necessity to be re-equipping people with what they need. So make it into a virtue and create a situation in which, and this is my other sort of passion, is to bring people into government who've got understanding of technology and are going to be able to devise the right solutions because they understand the way the world of work is going to change.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. We need the gulf to narrow, not widen, between the change makers and the policy makers. I totally take that point. And I also take the point about lifelong learning, because not only do you need to be schooled in technology from a very young age, but you need to stay schooled in what's coming next. I think it was Yuval Noah Harari, the author, who said it's not the rise of the robots that we should fear, but the question of whether we can reskill ourselves every 10 years or less. I think that's probably 5 years or less now, because the pace of change in tech is so fast that we need to stay up and current.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, but you see, the thing that's going to be interesting is whether government itself can change. So a lot of people in business and who are running their businesses, they understand they've got to change, because otherwise, frankly, they go out of business. I mean, the problem with government always, as I learned, is why the Institute works on government questions today, really around the efficacy of government, is that what you find in government is that the toughest things are, one, getting things done. People talk, but actually getting implementation in place is really difficult. And secondly, governments don't like change. Bureaucracies have a genius for inertia, but not for momentum to change. And Therefore, what is really important is for government also to be thinking, how do we reform our education system so that young people are taught differently and taught creatively? How do we, for example, change our healthcare system? We've probably had more technology innovation in our healthcare system in the last 10 weeks than we've had in the previous 10 years. You know, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but it's nonetheless, it makes the point that we have been driven by necessity in these last weeks to do things differently. But let's see how we continue to do things differently. Are we really saying that we want to go back to face-to-face consultations with doctors, except when we really need to, rather than carry on with what we've discovered during the course of this, which you can do consultations online? Do we really want to say that those lectures that are being done online now for students, do we really just want to go back to traditional learning rather than keeping some of that for the future? So I think in all of these areas, we've got to be making sure that government itself takes some of these lessons into its internal systems. Otherwise, you'll find business moves fast, but government moves slow.
Yes, no, I understand. So what do you see as the big prize if we get the immediate response right? At techUK, we've always advocated for a strong public-private partnership model, and that if you bring the right people together to address specific issues, that that does create an opportunity for change, and to some extent that's happened. Post COVID-19, do you think we'll go back to business as usual? Do you think that change might, and all the things that you've talked about, do you think that we will go back to where we were, especially and specifically around the government ways of working?
No, I think we won't go back to where we were, but I think there are also risks. I mean, part of the problem with politics is that at the very moment when the solutions to most of the world's problems are practical and require an understanding and knowledge of the way the world works, politics has gone heavily ideological, both on the right and the left. And the trouble with that is it's not that it's just a practical set of questions. Your values, what you're trying to do with the knowledge you have, is obviously driven by values. But the actual solutions themselves are often practical and therefore require a form of working, for example, between the private and public sector, where it's not an uneasy confrontational type of working, but it's a genuine spirit of, well, how do we sort this thing out together? And so I can't be sure what will happen afterwards, but what should happen is that we should put a huge focus on government and business working together. We're going to have to understand that there's a lot of issues where there'll be a strong desire for social change, and we need to make that social change happen in the best possible way. I think there'll be far less tolerance of inequality and injustice. People will want to resolve some of the questions around that, but you've got to resolve them with policies that work. And so I think what will be very important coming out of this crisis, if I was back in government now, I would be really focusing it all around this technology revolution and how do you make each individual component of government and the relations with business work in an effective way. And it will require, I think, bringing in people with different skill set into government as well. I think we've still got a very stratified type of civil service where you get really good people trying to do their best, but in circumstances where detailed knowledge and skill is going to be important.
Yes, and it's really interesting, isn't it, how when we look at the things that we need to change during the pandemic have accelerated really, really quickly. And as you say, necessity is the mother of invention. So it's not that we haven't been able to do it, but there hasn't been the momentum to do it. Now we've got the momentum. This is the opportunity to really make it work and make it work for everybody. I think that's the overriding point. Is there a way in which you think, on my mind is building a world that works for everybody, and I'm wondering how you think we can ensure that going back to the gulf between the haves and have-nots doesn't widen, not only in the UK but also internationally. And I know that there's a lot of work that you do in Africa, and I'm thinking about the pandemic as it reaches that part of the world. Have you got any thoughts there on how we can make sure that that gulf doesn't widen?
Well, I think short term it's going to be a big problem. I mean, we publish regular information around what's happening in Africa, and we've got teams of people in about 15 different countries there, including the largest ones. I mean, the problem is very, very simple. So if you take the total number of deaths in Africa from COVID-19 so far, they amount to around about 1/10 for the whole of the continent of Africa. Is about 1/10 of the number in the UK. So that's a continent of 1.2 billion people versus a country of 65 million. If you take the number of deaths in Africa every year from malaria, several hundred thousand, HIV/AIDS, several hundred thousand, various other forms of treatable diseases, another few hundred thousand. So if you're an African president or prime minister and you're looking at this situation at the moment, you're definitely thinking the cure is worse than the disease, because in addition to the other diseases, whilst you're trying to deal with COVID that you're not dealing with and therefore will spread more widely, you've got food supply problems, and you've got a situation where many people working in the informal economy, if they don't work, they don't eat. So you've got a big set of problems. Now, it's not clear, by the way, why those African fatality figures are so low. It could be they're just not testing enough. It could be the spike is still to come, or it could be there's an additional resilience amongst the population. But the risk is that for those countries, it's going to be far harder to come back out of lockdown fast and effectively. And if that doesn't happen, they're going to be left in a situation where in 1 or 2 years, they've got massive problems arising from this disease. So it's a very, very big challenge. But I think what you're going to find in Africa is that there is also a recognition by the governments. They've got to sort out their basic healthcare systems. They've got to industrialize faster. They've got to embrace new technology faster in order to try and circumvent some of the legacy systems of the West. So there'll be a big debate that happens there in the developing world, but their problems are going to be very, very acute and already are.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you said the problems that we had before will now be magnified. So they aren't going away. And as you say, creating health systems that work is an important part of moving forward. And also technology is an important part of going forward. And we will need more and more people using technology, and businesses adopting technology and pivoting their businesses online, possibly for the first time. And also schools becoming much more digitally enabled through their teaching curriculum, but also their teachers. And, you know, I know with my work with the Girl Guiding Association, for example, 500,000 girl guides across this country, and now they're starting to earn digital badges and in staying safe online, for example, and consent. So it's a really important thing that we need to work for everybody. So in closing then, Tony, is there, if you could wave a magic wand, anything on your mind that you think, right, okay, if we did this one thing, that would create a better outcome for us as we move outside the world of lockdown and global pandemics?
Yeah, I mean, it really would be, and it's the reason I wanted to come and do this session with you. It would be harnessing technology for the greater good, because that's the single most important thing that we can do. And, you know, people always say to me when I go on about this, they say, yeah, you keep talking about technology. And, you know, of course, it's technology, but what about social justice? What about, you know, economic opportunity? And I say all of these things depend on knowing the world in which you're going to be existing. And that is a world that's going to be transformed by technology. So harness it and make sure it works for the greater good. But don't pretend that technology is separate from issues to do with social justice or economic prosperity. They're the root to it if you use it properly.
Yeah. And I hope that people listening to this will be inspired to come into the technology industry, because we need more people inspired to join the technology industry. And certainly we need more people who have diverse thinking and are from diverse backgrounds, because in order to create tech that works for everybody in a world that works for everybody, we also need diverse voices building it too. So in the space of 30 minutes, which has gone so quickly, we have explored so many ways that tech can help us navigate this new context, and how, if we get it right, the immediate future we face could create longer lasting change that works for all of us. But what I think really comes out of this discussion for me is that technology remains a tool in the hands of humans. And without leadership that is willing to reach out to create public-private partnerships, for example, to galvanize change, without leaders who are willing to be bold and radical, then the technology will remain a tool likely left in the hands of too few. So techUK certainly, and I'm sure the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change will continue to support leaders to be bold. I hope everyone listening today understands that they can all play their part too, and think about how they might be able to push for much needed change and embrace technology and digital adoption into the future. Tony Blair, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts on lessons for the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Jacqueline. And that brings this session to an end. We're here on the global leadership stage at CogX 2020, and we'll be back soon.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.